let me give you a little bit of preliminary stuff while people are coming in, the last few people. This is a very silly idea, but there's actually some real technologies underneath it. The real subject of this talk is talking about building applications that combine Groovy with a NoSQL database, in this case MongoDB, with a RESTful web service, or accessing a RESTful web service in one sense, just to access, in this case it'll be a web service at Rotten Tomatoes. Combining that with serving up data from a Mongo database via a RESTful web service. Once I'm going to do part of it using Ratpack and then do another part using Grails, the new RESTful annotations in Grails 2.3 and above. Make that really nice. So while this is kind of a silly idea, and certainly by far the silliest abstract I've ever written, the concepts and the technologies are still relatively amusing. Now, I do have to make one meta comment here. There was a template provided by the powers that be for your slides, you know, both in PowerPoint and in Keynote. And unfortunately, I don't normally use either. I use Google Docs. And at first, I tried to convert everything over, and by this point, I've given up. So I have a title slide which looks right. So when you see the video on the screen, it'll be, see, it looks like all the others. Everything's fine. And then as soon as I pass that, I'm back into my own stuff. So I guess after I finish this presentation, I'm done, so I can't get in any more trouble. So at any rate. So the basic idea behind this talk is that I like learning new technologies by building small but non-trivial applications that combine them, you know, to have some overall purpose to do. And even if the purpose is ostensibly kind of a silly one, I figured I'd do that anyway. So this one is called Groovy Vampires, Groovy REST, NoSQL, and really bad marketing, as you'll see. And what was this all about? Well, the idea was, I was wandering in a Barnes & Noble one day. I went into my local Barnes & Noble, and I noticed that there was only one shelf labeled computer. I mean, remember, it used to be row after row after row, and of course, Borders had tons of them, and Borders is long gone. But Barnes & Noble had one shelf labeled computer, while at the same time, they actually had 3 labeled teen paranormal romance. I mean, they had enough teen paranormal romance books to make titles out of them. I mean, they actually manufactured those. I was impressed. So I decided I could either lament the decline of Western civilization, or I could add some groovy vampires to my book and use it as a marketing technique, see? So first of all, by the way, even though I wrote half of my book at the local Barnes & Noble in their cafe, they didn't have my book when it came out. So I went to the info desk and I said, hey, by the way, I'm a local author, you know, could you bring a couple of books in? I'll sign it and everything, or deface it, depending on your point of view. And they said, sure. So they actually ordered 2 copies, and they had them over in the computer section. And they sat there and they sat there. That's where the story begins, see? So let's look at this idea of teen paranormal romance. Of course, the prototypical book in that genre would be Twilight. It was a New York Times #1 bestseller. In 2008, it was the best-selling book in the world, really. Over 22 million copies were sold in that year alone. And it was then eventually made into a very boring major motion picture. As preparation for this talk, I seriously considered trying to watch it. I got about 5 minutes, and I still haven't made myself watch it yet, but I've heard mixed things. I don't know, I'm not wild about the idea of vampires that sparkle. That, you know, that just seems wrong somehow. On the other hand, my book is called Making Java Groovy. It's a Java Groovy integration book. It's a book that basically looks at what Java developers do and tries to see how you could add Groovy to make your life easier. And in that book, I have working with NoSQL databases, and I have Grails applications, and I have working with RESTful web services. And I don't have Ratpack, but the next edition will, right? Assuming there's a next edition. Somebody's got a, well, never mind. Any rate, the New York Times bestseller list has ignored it so far. I have not heard anything from them at the moment. The reviews at Amazon are really, really good. That part's actually true. And I do have to say, how about this? It was nominated for a Jolt Award, which I'm very proud of. Of course, it turns out that you just go to the website and there's a form you fill out, it turns out. I said to Manning, hey, you want to submit my book for me? And they're like, we don't really do that. I said, do you care if I do that? You know, I have to give them an ebook or something. They're like, whatever. So, hey, you know, I should hear any time now, right? So, at any rate, put it part of the marketing materials. It turns out, by the way, there's a form to fill out on the Pulitzer nomination form, but that one, I'm sorry, I'm not that brave. I thought about it, but I'm not going to do that. So, at any rate, clearly what my book needs in order to make the New York Times bestseller list are groovy vampires. And that's what triggered this whole silliness. So how am I going to do this? Well, it turns out that if you go to imdb.com, they don't really have a developer API that I found useful in any way. I really couldn't find anything that I could work with. But Rotten Tomatoes, on the other hand, had a rather extensive developer API. And it's all written in the form of a RESTful web service. Now, the downside is that it only supports GET requests. It's not get, post, put, and delete. I was hoping that it would allow me to, say, post a comment or a review or something like that, but no such luck. Now, the actual... This is the actual website for Rotten Tomatoes, and you see all the pictures. Hey, speaking of, you know. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry, never mind. I got my Hunger Games mixed up with my vampire book, you know. And maybe I should move on. At any rate, this is developer.rottentomatoes.com. This is where they have their API. Welcome to the Rotten Tomatoes API. And you have to register for an account, and they have their own what they call dynamic documentation. And if I go to that, then they want the API key. Fortunately, what can happen is all I have to do is log in. And I wonder if I have the right one here. I do. So if you want to copy down that API key really fast, you know. Whoop, gone, sorry. Of course, you have a video, but so be it. What am I going to do with it? I can't, you know. You see, when I'm given things like this, I wind up making presentations and doing bad jokes, so maybe you're better off with it anyway. Notice what they have here. They have everything in the form of URIs, or URLs more properly. And in the URLs, I can magnify this little piece at the end here. You can see they do their content negotiation directly in the URL. So most RESTful web services these days would not wire in .json necessarily. They would just use an accept header with application/JSON in it, and then you'd get back the proper content type. Here they've decided to wire it in directly. I don't know if they'll do that long term, but that's the basic idea. The REST principles, again, the idea of everything is an addressable resource. Well, you can see here they have box office and in theaters, etc. Down here, if I go to the search one, this is movies.json. And when I click on it, there's my query string to put in something like, oh, vampires or whatever. And if I click try it, then what we'll get back is, first of all, this is the full URL. Notice the Q equals vampires, so that I can do this programmatically myself. And here's my response status, which is a 200 OK. There's the response headers. You may notice the content type is listed as text/JavaScript rather than text/JSON, but I suppose that's because they're rendering it in this browser. I've gotten back application/JSON, and it looks just fine. Anyway, so the first concept is the idea of addressable resources, and that's what I have here is an addressable resource. The second concept is the one of the so-called uniform interface. You never put any actual verbs in the URL. You're restricted to the HTTP verbs, get, post, put, delete, sometimes head or options or patch occasionally, depending on what you're trying to do. And then the third concept is the content negotiation part. You see, they've done that by wiring it into the URL. They don't support XML or plain or any other content type, none of the hypermedia ones or anything like that, just JSON. And then the fourth concept is the hypermedia. This is one of the few publicly available APIs that actually does address hypermedia to some sense. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at the response body here, apparently I got 81 movies with the search key of vampires, plural. Vampires. And you see there's movies is a collection. Is that big enough? Can you read that in the back? You're younger than I am. Well, it figures. But at any rate, you see that while we have titles and years and ratings and everything, Down here, if I scroll down a bit, there is a section called links. And inside links, we have a self-link and alternate and cast and reviews and similar. This is the basic hypermedia as the engine of application state, you know, the hate AOS, I mean, an unpronounceable acronym that has the word hate in it, you know, that they use for hypermedia these days. Now, in the Java world, and of course Groovy is built on top of that world, in the Java world, there's a spec called JAX-RS, the Java API for XML, I mean, but it's web services, RESTful services, defines links in two different ways. There's either structural links, which are part of the response. That's what we have here. Or they're transitional links, which are in the headers. The benefit to transitional links is that the client doesn't have to be able to parse the response in order to find the links. There'd be a standard, and they could pull them out of the headers. They don't appear to have really caught on, though, and most people are using these structural links here when they do hypermedia at all. I mean, I got to say, in the vast majority of the Java world, the whole idea of hypermedia at all has been lost. Yeah, very few people are using it in any way at all. And the REST people, the REST advocates, are not happy about this. I think I mentioned this yesterday. Do you know what REST advocates actually call themselves, the real strong REST advocates? Anybody know? Yeah, they're Restafarians. Isn't that awful? I mean, I thought my jokes were bad. And, you know, the way they argue, I mean, they used to say one of the few benefits of SOAP over REST is you don't get two developers sitting around arguing as to what is or is not SOAPful. You know, the REST advocates will scream at each other about this stuff, you know. But at any rate, they feel that if you're not doing hypermedia, the so-called Richardson maturity model, then you're not really doing REST at all, and that's how the arguments start. But at any rate, so here's links inside the individual movies, and if I go down to the bottom of the response here, you'll see that they also have links on the, that they're using for pagination. Here. They have a self link and a next link, and you can see the URI, or URL in this case, has a page equals 1, page equals 2 property in it. So they're also using the hypermedia, if you will, for pagination in this process. So this is the API I have to deal with here. This is the basic set of information that I want to process. Okay, other way. So again, you need a key. You do need to register in order to get the key, but then they provide API access through GET requests, and that's just a snapshot of the site that I put inside the slides. And there's your 4 concepts of addressable resources, uniform interface, content negotiation, and I think even the Restafarians have given up on trying to pronounce that. They just call it hypermedia these days. Now, specifically in my case, there's my addressable resource, is that I have this URL which ends in movies.json and then just takes certain parameters at the end of it. So if I'm going to do this programmatically, I need to assemble a URL of this sort in order to access the resource. Now, the uniform interface, well, I'm already restricted to GET requests. Now, most publicly available RESTful APIs are restricted to GET requests because that way they don't have to deal with transactions. They don't have to worry too much about security. Here, they're simply doing security by making you register and having a key that you send in. But in principle, you would have to, like if you're using Amazon's RESTful web service, for example, they often make you create a token called signing key or something like that. They make you make a digital signature of the request and take that digital signature and pass that as another parameter through. Various ways to do security. By doing a read-only web service, you don't have to do any of this. If this is only supporting GET requests, of course I have a friend who refers to it as a GETful web service. And then I couldn't help thinking that, well, if it's stateless, I suppose that makes it a forgetful web service. Ha, 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 ha. Yeah, not too many people I can use that gag on, so, you know, you got nominated. Sorry. The content negotiation part here is that normally, I mean, this is what changes the concept of a resource into a representation, as in representational state transfer for REST. The resource is the movie. The representation, in this case, will be in JSON form. In principle, the client is supposed to be able to request for a representation by specifying the MIME type they want. And the mechanism for doing that varies among various web services. As you see in this one, they wired it in the URL. most web services these days put it as an accept header inside the request, and then in the response header of the content type header of the response, it tells you what you got back. If you're doing a post, for example, if you're adding one, you use both an accept header and a content type header. The content type says what you're sending, JSON data, and the accept header says what you want back, presumably, again, JSON data, in most cases these days. Here, all we have is JSON, and it's hardwired in the URL. Now, the hypermedia part was the business about those links, either the self and next links for the pagination or the embedded links on each movie, etc. And that's all I want to say about that at this point. But I will be addressing that in my API, or in my little client program. Now, first of all, if I have to do a post, put, or delete in Groovy, it's not that much easier than doing it in Java, which means it's no fun at all, which means you use a library. I mean, most everybody uses a REST client of one form or another, and there are several available. I happen to be rather fond of the HTTP Builder project, which is one that's a Groovy wrapper on Apache's HTTP client. And it has a very clean, simple interface. I have examples of using that in my book. I didn't need it here, though, because if all you want to do is a GET request, then the string class has a .toURL method in the Groovy JDK, which will convert the string into an instance of java.net.url. And then the URL class in the Groovy JDK has a getText method, which will retrieve all the data. So simply by doing something this simple, I'm going to wind up retrieving all the data that I want, and I'm going to illustrate that in a moment. So if I had to do post, puts, or deletes, I would go on to a separate library. But since I don't have to do that, I'm just going to access the data using this mechanism right here and then parse the result using the JSON slurper or other mechanisms. Another mechanism I'm going to demonstrate, by the way, is the use of, for example, the JSON library, the Google JSON library, for converting JSON data into objects. So I'll get to that as well. Now, the URL needs a query string, and I figured I'd start off with Blazing Saddles. I had an idea in mind. So a nice classic movie that pretty much everybody has seen, and if you haven't, then you have a real treat in front of you. You know, wonderful movie there. So my URL needs a query string, and this is a pattern I use frequently for assembling query strings. What I do is I start with a map, and you see here's my map where I just put in keys and values, or K1 and K2 are my keys, and V1 and V2 are the values. And if you take the map and you use a collect method on the map, then if the collect method takes 2 arguments, it separates the keys from the values automatically. Now, a collect method in Groovy transforms a collection by applying a closure to each element and gives you back a list. So my result's going to be a list. It starts off as a map. What I want to do is turn K:V into K equals V. You know, I want key equals value, and then I want to join them all with an ampersand, and key 2 equals value 2, and key 3 equals value 3. And this is a nice, simple idiom for doing it. The only thing that I do make a modification to this in practice, which I'll show you. And the modification is, if I'm really going to send this as a query string, the values cannot have spaces in them or quotes or things like that. So I have to URL encode them first. So I'll URL encode all the values and then transform them using a mechanism like this. You can even actually, I've even done a little bit of Groovy metaprogramming to take map and add a toQS method that does this, so that I could just simply say, oh, here's my map, and there, toQS, and it builds my query string, and I'm all set. It's a nice, simple pattern to follow, very simple idiom in Groovy. So I'm going to show you this in pieces here, and then I'll go to the actual code and you'll see it. First of all, I took my API key and I put it in a file, and I wrapped a new file around it, .text. So this is the file that is in my .gitignore file. So if you were to check this system out, I'm going to show you where all the code is, because almost everything I'm going to show you is in a GitHub repository. If you were to check this out from my GitHub repository, it does not have the key in it. You'll have to register your own and put it in that text file, and then you can go ahead and use it. I should have given it to you, but I don't know. Any rate, then the base URL is the one that ends in the question mark. And then here is my transformation, and notice the URL encoder .encode going on, which is going to encode the title under the encoding scheme UTF-8, and that all it's going to do in this case is replace the space with pluses. That's about all it's going to do. And then this is a shorthand that Paul King pointed out to me once. It turns out if you do collect on a map and you specify 2 arguments in the closure, then it separates the keys from the values. That's what I just showed on the earlier slide. But if you specify 1 argument, it's the map.entry inner class for each element of the map. And it turns out the toString method on map.entry is key equals value. See, so as soon as I go join with an ampersand, the result of the join method is a string. So basically, it invokes toString on every element, turning it into key equals value, and then joining them with the ampersand. But that's how everybody learns Groovy, by the way. I mean, when I first was learning Groovy, I would find some little problem I wanted to try, and then I would do it, and then I would write a blog post about it. And one of the core team members would wander by, and their responses were inevitably something like, "Oh, great, nice job. By the way, did you know if you did this, you could cut your code in half?" You know, something like that. How to make it even groovier, if you will. And this was, again, something that Paul King pointed out to me. I didn't have to do this process from before of doing 2 arguments into key equals value. All I had to do was say return the element, and when you do the join, that will invoke the toString method, and the toString for a map.entry is key equals value. And there you go. At any rate, once I have that, this is the full URL, the base followed by the query string. So that there is, it turns out in Groovy, there is a class called JSON output, which has a method called prettyprint on it. So if I take my URL and convert it, well, I take my string, convert it to a URL, and then retrieve the data, I can do a prettyprint. The only thing, this is slightly misleading here, because it turns out the prettyprint method doesn't actually print. It formats. So I still have to print the result. So it returns a string, which I then print, and you can see everything is nicely formatted and has all kinds of depth to it. And I'm going to show you in the code the full example there, which has a certain amount of detail in it. This, by the way, is another reason I like doing problems like this, because whenever you read about converting JSON data into objects or anything like that, they're always talking about 1 class with 3 attributes, and you know, if I can't make that work, I might as well give it up. It's when you've got depth like this, you're like, wow, I've got some decisions to make. That's when I really actually feel like I learned something. Okay, so now inside there, inside each movie are these links, and I can traverse that to get to the links. And for example, one of them is the complete cast. And when I was looking for Blazing Saddles, the reason I was using Blazing Saddles is I wanted to get to Mongo. Now, first of all, there's the links for the pagination, and there's Mongo from the movie, Mongo Only Pawn in Game of Life. And it turns out that if you get just Blazing Saddles as a movie, you don't get Mongo because he didn't make it into the abbreviated cast. And it's a real shame. I mean, Alex Karras, that's the peak of the Alex Karras oeuvre, if you will. And it's a shame he didn't make it into the abbreviated cast. So already I needed to do the hypermedia. I needed to return the details and then follow the cast URL, the link there, so that I could go get Mongo as well. This is what he would look like inside the rest of the cast. So that inevitably leads us to Mongo database, which is, again, why I was using Mongo. See, when I initially started playing with this, I retrieved the JSON data, and then I thought, well, I don't want to constantly have to make queries at the RESTful web service. When you have a data that's going to change all the time, well, sure, maybe you do want to keep it live, but it's not like these movie sets of data change at all. So I wanted to store it locally. And my first thought was, oh, I'm going to put this in a relational database, and how the heck am I going to map this deeply nested tree structure into relational data? That doesn't sound like any fun at all. And then what dawned on me was, hey, I finally have a use case for a NoSQL database. Because I was looking for one, I didn't have a good one. And the reason I use Mongo database is because, I mean, first of all, there's the web page, mongodb.org, is that it's document-based. In other words, it stores JSON data as its native data structure. They don't call it JSON data, they call it BSON. It's binary JSON, they've optimized it and everything. But it's open source, it's got full indexing, and it has a nice little query mechanism using JavaScript so that you can take your JSON data and simply append it to a collection. And you've stored it in a Mongo database, and you still have full indexing and query capabilities. So I was like, oh, wonderful, I'm going to do that. So I need to do that now. So now that I've gotten to this point, let me start running some of this stuff. Now on my machine here, I have Mongo running as a server. I'll show you the process here. All I have to do is kill it right here and clear that. And on my Mac, I've installed MongoDB using the homebrew install, and I just say MongoD, and it starts up the daemon, and it's running by default on port 27017. You can, of course, customize all of that all you want. You could make it run in the background. I don't need it to be running all the time. I just start it right here in a window so that I can access it. Now, if I go to my code, then my code is in this IntelliJ project here, which I'll explain. So the first thing is the Rotten Tomatoes one. Actually, I want to show you the Blazing Saddles one. So I need to see in order here. Okay, that one's retrieving the data. Here we go. This is it. Sorry about that. Okay. So my API key is in that file. The .text method on a file retrieves all the data in the file. All I have in that file is the key. So that's a very easy way to retrieve it. There's my base URL. Here's my mechanism with this. And since I'm using a somewhat bigger font, there's no reason I can't put a carriage return in here and make it a little easier to see. So here's my API key, and the query is URL encoder, encode Blazing Saddles under UTF-8, collect it, and join with the ampersand. I will print the URL so you'll get a chance to see it. And then here is the print of the pretty print mechanism that retrieves all the data. Now, once I have all that data, I need to parse it. In the Groovy API, we have a class called JSON Slurper that's also in the groovy.json package, and it has a method called parseText. Now, in the XML Slurper class, there's a whole series of parse overloads, one of which just takes a URI, so that you could just take a string and go there. In the JSON Slurper class, they didn't used to have all those overloads. They only had a single parse method that took a reader, which wasn't what I wanted, but they always have a parseText method, so that if you retrieve the JSON data, you can simply parse it after the fact. And in this case, that was easier, even though they've now added a bunch of parse methods to it. So here I'm going to do parseText on this, and what basically it does is it converts this string into basically a set of maps, Groovy maps that contain either nested Groovy maps or lists or strings or numbers, because that's all JSON supports anyway. It really brings home, by the way, the difference between a dynamically typed language like Groovy, or really Groovy's optionally typed, right? You can put in a static type if you want, or you could say def if you want to be dynamically typed, and a language that basically has no typing at all, like JSON. Okay, you'd call that a weakly typed language. Strong versus weak is a whole different axis from dynamic versus static. Groovy is dynamically typed, but it's strongly typed. I have classes. I know what things are. I know how they're structured. Whereas JSON data, I have no idea what anything is. I just have keys and values, basically. Don't have any meaning at all. So at any rate, I parsed it, and now I can go into the movies element. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, here is, in fact, the JSON data that I get back for this particular one. I saved it in a file here. So you see there's one movie, and there's an element called movies. So that's why in my script here I accessed movies square bracket 0, the first element there. And then inside that I have all this data. Now, there's release dates, there's ratings, critics ratings and audience ratings, synopsis, which is empty here, posters, a bridge cast, and on, and then we get alternate IDs and the links, as well as this one. Now down here at the bottom, because there was only one element, there's no next or previous. I just have a self link, and this link template explains the parameters you use to do the search at all. So in principle, that's like using URI templates like in Spring REST or whatever, if you want to use the REST client from Spring. So this is what I'm trying to process. So what I'm going to do here is get the movie, and then if I want to get all the cast, then I go just for the movie, and oh, I'm sorry, I needed to get the rest of the cast in order to get Mongo, because Mongo wasn't in the abridged cast. I don't know if you noticed that as I zoom by. I mean, there's Clevon Little and Gene Wilder and Slim Pickens and Harvey Korman, and that's, I mean, even Madeline Kahn didn't make it, which doesn't seem right somehow, you know. But so be it. But down here is the full cast under links. That's the URL for that. So here I go to movie.links.cast and put the API key on there and toURL.text and grab all that. And now I can print all the cast members based on the response I get there. And also I can even do a find with the closure here to make sure that Mongo's in there somewhere. So if I execute this simply as a Groovy script, it will go out to Rotten Tomatoes and show all this data. And here I'm actually printing the output. There's the pretty printed output. And there's the cast in this way that I decided to print them one by one. Characters, ID, and name going all the way through. And there's Mongo. And there's the IDs. And it's like, huh, okay, that looks complicated. And there you are. And of course, the find worked. And of course, now I'm looking at it thinking, I meant for that to be an assert. That's not doing anything. I mean, it's doing something, but I'm not getting any output from that. It's not accomplishing anything. I'll fix that before I commit it. Actually, I'll fix it way before I commit it. There, now it's fixed. Okay, so at any rate, that's all that was necessary to execute the GET requests in order to bring down the information. Now, that's just for one movie, though. If I want to get a whole collection of movies, like I want to get all these vampire movies, then I have to do something a little bit more powerful. So what I have for that is my little retrieve movies script again. And in this case, I'm simply going to the movies API with query equals vampire. And for this script, just to prove that it works, I'm just printing how many there are. And as you will see, I believe there are 319 or something like that. Now, my query is searching for... well, no. I mean, with single vampire, there was supposed to be a lot more than that. Oh, well. I could check out what the actual data was, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. Certainly, it did make it to Rotten Tomatoes and do the parsing and printed everything out. So I'm not going to get into the details there. Now, if I look at the next step is, how am I going to populate? Oh, by the way, this is that meta class magic I was mentioning, is that I could just say, let's take the meta class off of map and add a toQuery string method that calls the delegate, that's the map that you invoke this method on, and does a collect and a join, and this would be a little test to show that it works. And again, this is not useful yet because I have to do the URL encoding as well. But if I did that, then I would have a single method that I could use over and over again. And if I have a whole bunch of them to do, then I sometimes do something like this. The alternative is just to write a little method to do it for you. But either way, that would be fine. So now, where does the MongoDB part come in here? Well, it turns out, I think I have it in the slides here, that MongoDB has a client program called Mongo, so I can access it from the command line. And then I could do commands like show databases and use the particular database. When you append to a database, you create it. You don't have to do anything special. You just say, hey, I'm making one. And then inside the database are collections. Again, you just append to it to create it. And there's a series of collections, and then I can go into the individual collections and do a find. So to show you what this looks like, if I open up another tab here, actually I think I've got one ready. Oh, sorry. That keyboard shortcut. If I said Mongo right here, then I could do show databases, and there's a whole series of them. One is from Marco Vermeulen's talk that he just gave on Invader Zim and everything in using Spring Boot with Groovy. But you see I have one called movies, and if I use movies, then I can say show collections. And you see that I have one called Vampire Movies and one called Other Movies, which I'm going to illustrate for you in a minute. And then if I did, say, Vampire Movies, db.vampiremovies.find, I would get back all of them, when in reality, they show a bunch, I think it's 20 by default, and say if you type it, you'll get the next 20. etc. And this is an interactive JavaScript-based console that supports their API for doing querying. So it's all JavaScript, and I don't know about you, but the thing I don't really need more in my life is more JavaScript. So I wasn't wild about that, and of course that's not something that's going to be easy for me to query from Groovy. How am I going to do this from Groovy? So what I ultimately want, of course, other way, sorry about that, is a driver. And there is a Java driver available. There's a link there. You can go download it. You can take a look at it. There's a set of Java docs. You will see that this is the sort of API that is what gives Java a bad name. I mean, it's very verbose with awkwardly named classes and strange mechanisms. And you're like, really? This is what they want us to use? You know? And whereas all the other drivers look so much simpler, but you can use it. There's not a problem. Of course, what I'd like to do is do something with Groovy instead. And it turns out, oh, this, by the way, is what the basic object is in the Java driver. BasicDBObject actually extends linked hash map, no less. So it has put methods with keys and values and get methods, but you're getting back objects that are wrapping domain classes. You know, so you're not getting back the domain class. You're not even getting back a string. You're getting back a basic DB object with put and get methods. It's like, well, I guess I could deal with that, and people do, but I'd rather do something with Groovy. Well, it turns out that Paolo Piotti, I don't know how to pronounce it, went and did something that is a very typical Groovy idiom. What he did is he took an existing Java API and he added a Groovy wrapper around it to make the thing much easier to follow and much easier to understand. And he called it gmongo. And here I have that web page available. Here is the well, first of all, here's the MongoDB one in case I need to look at some references here. Here is the gmongo project, which is at GitHub. And I want to show you something. I mean, he's got the description in here, and he says it doesn't extend Mongo, it delegates to Mongo. And I'll show you that in a moment. Notice that he has a class called gmongo. Let me make that bigger so you can see it a little better. And then you just say get DB of the name of the database that you're looking for, and now you could do things like inserts or even a left shift to do an append, or you can do queries by doing a find one off of one of the keys, or you can do find in general, and that'll return a whole series of them, a collection, and updates and deletes. In other words, it's much more clean and comfortable as opposed to using the Java API. But the thing I want to show you here is if I go to the actual source code, inside the source code, in the main Groovy com gmongo package is gmongo.groovy, and in here, and this is the best part, take a look, there's the @delegate annotation, the AST transformation representing delegation. Essentially what he has done is he said, well, there's already a class in Java's API called Mongo, and I'll just do an @delegate, and now every method in Mongo is now exposed through gmongo. And the whole rest of this is just cleaning up certain constructors and how to access things, certain patches he felt he had to do, and that's the whole API. It's simply a wrapper around the delegate, and it's a beautiful use of the delegate annotation. I mean, it's exactly what it was designed to do. So now I need the gmongo class, the driver, and once I do that, then I can access my database in this much cleaner mechanism. So if I go back to the code here, first of all, here is my Gradle build file. And in my Gradle build file, I have my Groovy plugin and the IDE plugins. And I am going to use Maven Central because I wrote this a while ago. If I was doing it now, I'd probably make it JCenter. In case any of the bin tray people are here, you know, it'd be JCenter. And down in the dependencies, there's my Groovy dependency. Here's my gmongo dependency. That's from the Maven repository, to grab that from Maven Central. And then I'm also going to use a JSON dependency. And for some weird reason, when I wrote this, I didn't put in Spock tests. I just did regular JUnit tests. But good enough. You know, I do have something, some mechanism to work with this. So how do I actually use this? Here is Populate Mongo, the Mongo database, from Rotten Tomatoes. Actually, that's more complicated. Let me do the simpler one first. So the simpler one says, instantiate the gmongo class. That's all I have to do is instantiate it, and then I get the database called movies that I've got ready. And here it says db.othermovies, that's looking for the collection called other movies. Question mark dot means that if it's null, just return null. It's the safe navigation operator, question mark dot in Groovy. That's one of those things, if you're a Groovy person and you want to convince Java people how cool Groovy is, I never would have believed how many Java developers get excited about that. You know, I mean, I don't have to write all those null checks. Sometimes they get tears in their eyes. Really? It's that easy? I don't have to write if, not, null, you know, all this. You know, so I do my safety reference operator. If it is not null, then I call find and count, and there's my before count, and I'm going to have an after count as well to see that the after is one more than the before. But the idea now is I'm going to go to my JSON slurper and parse that text. See, I already downloaded the file, so I'll just parse the file. Grab the movies off of it, print the title of the first movie, and then if the find one on Blazing Saddles is not there, then all I have to do is the left shift. See, I have a JSON object, I have a collection, I append it. And by the way, I don't need to prepare that collection ahead of time. Just by saying db.othermovies and left shift Blazing Saddles creates the collection if it's not there. Then I'll just check the count and see that it went up by 1, for example. And I can also do my check if I do a find one that I get that result out of it. And it does work, in fact. Now, by the way, IntelliJ has, and of course now, am I seeing it or not? No, where's my, oh, there was a plugin. I don't know how to, oh, here it is. I don't know how to scroll on these yet. I don't know how to close these on the right-hand side. If anybody knows how to do that, please let me know afterwards, okay? At any rate, they have a Mongo Explorer inside of here. And if I do, I configured my database. It looks like when I shut it down, I killed it. So if I just say that this is on localhost, this will allow me to browse the collections. And if I don't put anything in there, it won't restrict it at all. So when I say OK, and say apply and OK here and double click on it, I believe, when it refreshes. Come on, refresh. It's not doing it right now. But the idea is it will show me all the collections inside there, and I can actually browse the Mongo database from within this mechanism. Since that's taken its time, I'm not going to worry about it right now. Now, here is the script to actually, let me close some of these things. I want to do the one that populates the Mongo database from all the movies. So here is my populate MongoDB from Rotten Tomatoes. Again, this time I get the movies collection. I call drop to get rid of it, get rid of the collection called Vampire Movies. I drop that. I get my JSON slurper ready. So here I pull in the key. There's my base URL. There's the API key in Vampire with the collect and the join, and print it out. And then, I'm sorry, here's where I print it out. Then the parse text with the data, and simply append. There's the whole thing. I just did the append right there. And the only issue I have now is that there's supposed to be several hundred Vampire Movies there, and it's only going to serve them up to me a page at a time. So I have to traverse the pagination links in order to get them all, meaning for the first time in years, I actually had a use case for a do-while loop. You know, do it once and then do it every time after that. And the one construct that Groovy does not support, the one Java construct that does not work in Groovy is do-while loops. I'm blown away by that. I mean, the one thing where they went, no, that's just too ugly, we are not doing that, was do-while. Okay, whatever. So at any rate, I append the first page, and then I traverse down to the next link and see that that's there. And while that next link is not null, print it, go grab the next link with the API key, append the results, and then next is updated to the next link from the results. And this will loop until there are no more next links. Really, it's screaming for a do-while, but whatever. And then I print out the total count here. If I do this, I don't want to do this right now because on the off chance that it wouldn't work, I don't want to kill my database, which is what I would be doing here. So I'm just going to show you this and just ask you to take my word for it that it does in fact work, and it prints out all the URLs and populates the database. Okay, so this populated it. Now what if I want to query it? here is a class to query the database, or a script rather, is that again, I just instantiate the gmongo class, get the movies database, I can print out how many are in there, and this is a little query using the gmongo API that says find, and you put in the property, and this is going to do a regular expression match. What I'm trying to say is, show me all the movies that have a critics consensus that is not empty. You know, that has something in it. Although actually I didn't say not empty, did I? But I'm looking for ones where the critics consensus field exists at all. One of the things that distinguishes JSON, of course, from relational schemas is that not every field and every property shows up in every response. So in the Rotten Tomatoes API, if there are no critics consensus values, they leave out the entire element, as opposed to setting it to null or empty string or something like that. So this is saying, let me look through all of my data and find the ones that have a critics consensus. Now, let me take this commented part and uncomment it and switch this. Then you'll see what I'm going to do here is I'm going to print out for each movie that has a critics consensus. Let's see the ID, the title, and the critics consensus. And then I can also demonstrate this, but I'm going to comment that out as well. I don't need it right at the moment. Okay, so let me execute this, and I'll show you something interesting. And there they all are. And this is each one. There's 319 movies in my database that was populated from the previous one. And there's the title and the critics consensus, which now see, I just went to the trouble to say they don't set it to empty. Sometimes they do. I mean, this again, when you work with real world, quote, real world, I mean, it's Rotten Tomatoes, but real world examples, sometimes things are a little odd. Down here, they have a lot of data. These, they have a critics consensus that's an empty string, and on all the rest of the movies, there's no critics consensus element at all in there. Now, the part I really want to point out is this guy, the first column, these IDs. Now, these are not IDs that have anything to do with Rotten Tomatoes. Okay? Or actually, these are IDs from Rotten Tomatoes. I want to talk about a different set of IDs, and those are the IDs that are generated by MongoDB. MongoDB doesn't just use an auto number type of thing. It has this powerful object ID type class that it uses to generate IDs, and suddenly getting an ID is not such a trivial operation anymore. This is much bigger. Now, what do you do with all this JSON data? How am I going to populate it and then use it? Well, in my actual system, I want to use it as objects. Now, it is possible to use something like Google's JSON to do that. So let me show you for a moment. If I leave the data here so you can see what I'm trying to map to, and I have an example here where I'm mapping it from JSON, and it's right here, JSON to JSON.Groovy. Nuts. Then the problem I have is that I have to come up with the classes to map it to. So on all the JSON examples you find online, you have one class with 5 parameters, or maybe a nested class, maybe, and that's it. You could see that isn't going to work if my data is this size. I have a whole series of nested objects here, and of course the nesting is completely up to me. I got to figure out how to do the resolution of all this stuff. So here's how I did it. I said, all right, I'm going to make a class called response. That's for the whole thing that came back. And inside that I have a total and an array of movie objects and an array of links objects, and it's awkward enough calling it links, but that's what I called it. And there's that template. A links just has the self in it in this particular case. In the other ones, I'll add in the next and the previous and all of that. Here's my movie class with all of these different pieces. I actually made an enum for the MPAA rating to put that in there. And here's my ratings that has to do with audience versus critics ratings, not MPAA rating. Posters, cast members, etc., all in here. And basically, this is just top-down, building classes off of the response and coming up with the data types myself and eventually just going, the heck with it, they're strings, you know, in many cases. Yes, sir? There's a website where you can paste in the JSON and it'll generate the Java classes from it? JSON schema one. Could you send me a link? Yeah, if I get the link so early enough, I can do it in front of it. No, I got other things to do. But yeah, I would love to see that, because I thought I had to do all this by hand. At any rate, if you do it by hand, see, here's my ratings with the critics rating and score, the audience rating and score. There's the dates and everything. Then you wind up, I can then say from JSON, and there's my JSON data, to this response object, and it populates the whole object automatically. Okay? So this does in fact work. If I execute this little script here, you will see that I wound up with a response here. And by the way, notice the ASD transform again with the @toString, which is generating a toString method that puts in the fully qualified class name plus attributes and the values of the attributes. And I put toString on all of these classes so that you can work your way down and see all of the data coming out that way. So this is one way to handle it. The problem with this is that you can get into issues of converting like enums and things if they have dashes in it and stuff like that. You can wind up with compatibility issues on various classes if they already exist. Now, since I went to the trouble to make this, you can see I then changed all of this. So let me get out of this script. And I made something a bit bigger. Here is my entities package that has everything in it. And what you'll notice about my movie class in here, in addition to having all the properties, is in this case I put in my own static method called fromJSON. So rather than use Google's JSON, I actually made my own fromJSON class. Again, part of the problem with doing it the way I wrote it here before is I have to match all of these attribute names. And therefore, I'm going to get an attribute called MPAA_rating, which makes sense in JSON, but looks funny in Java or Groovy. I'm going to get a bunch of little odd things like that. Sometimes I can even get actually, no, those aren't too bad, but that's about what I get. So if I do it by hand, I can make up the mapping myself. I can handle it all any way I want. Like, for example, here I could say, make a movie and take the ID and convert it to a long manually. And convert the year to an integer, for example, although in principle I should do a date, but I don't enjoy Java's date and time handling pre-Java 8 any more than anybody else does, so I went with an int on that. Here's my switch case on the MPA rating, so that when the rating in the JSON data had a dash in it, I used the proper enum with an underscore, that sort of thing. See, and the others I just use whatever they were, R, whatever, that comes through just fine. Here, if the runtime is not there, I'll use 0. Critics consensus, I can put in an empty string if it's not there. I can go through my release dates. I can walk through this whole thing. And while it was a little tedious to walk my way down doing each piece of it, I only had to do it once. And now I've got a set of classes that maps just right to my anticipated JSON structure coming back. Okay? Now, I don't truly need that if all I wanted to do was query this and print something out to the screen. But what I'd like to now do is shift gears and say, now that I've retrieved the data and populated a Mongo database, what if I want to serve up that data from a Mongo database? What if I want to serve that up through a server somehow? How am I going to do that? So I've done the first half, which is to acquire it and save it. Now I want to return it for other people who might want it. And that's what's going to lead me to both Ratpack and Grails in this case. So there was the gmongo project. There's the Groovy idiom saying it uses @delegate to wrap the Java class. There's the @delegate annotation on Mongo. And as a way to do some transition here, I'll just say there's my book sitting in the computers section, and it doesn't exactly stand out, so I figured that was a problem. So since it didn't seem to go anywhere, nobody seemed to be getting it or anything, and I figured, okay, what I really need to do is to take the book and move it over to the teen paranormal romance section, right? So I'll get to that in a moment. So at any rate, I do my GET request, I parse the results into JSON objects, simply append to a database collection, and follow the links in order to do the pagination from Rotten Tomatoes so that I get all the movies. Walking through it one by one, there's the movies.json. Here is the conversion to movies themselves. These are parsed and everything, so they're basically maps. And then appended to the collection, or appended to the new collection. I have it. And then here's the while loop to walk through the links and bring up all the rest of those. And by the way, here's proof that in my book, on page 220, I actually talk about groovy vampires, and I've got this stuff in here. So when I do move it over to the teen paranormal romance section, I'm not really lying. I mean, there are groovy vampires in the book, you know. Okay, moving on. Mapping to classes, JSON is nice, and I just showed you that script. Alternatively, I can map the classes myself, which is what I did. These are the entity classes I came up with, and then wrote the from JSON method in order to extract the data from the map and populate the objects. And here now is the book over in the teen paranormal romance section. See, there's Twilight down here. And, I mean, I don't really know all these others, but they all have to do with vampires and romance, and teens, I suppose. And I made it face out. Notice it's even autographed copy, see? So, you know, I mean, they had it featured right on the info desk, and it was really kind of sad when I came in a couple weeks later. It was still there, you know? So, at any rate, now one of them was over in the teen paranormal romance section, and then I went away to travel again, as I do. So, okay, now what if I want to serve up this data? I have two mechanisms here, and how much time do I have? Like half an hour? Is that right? We go till noon, right? Okay, I want to show you the Ratpack one, and then I'll show you the Grails one. Both of them are pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The Ratpack one is in a GitHub repo now. The Grails one is not, but it's very simple. I'm going to add it a little bit later. Ratpack, if you haven't seen it so far at this conference, is a micro framework, if you will. It's one of those little frameworks that serves up REST data very easily, but it's got some very nice features to it. First of all, it runs on Java 8, and it uses Netty as its internal engine rather than Jetty or something like that, and that means it does asynchronous responses really, really well. So they can get warp speed out of this thing. The biggest problem I have with Ratpack right now is that the documentation isn't there yet. It's very hard to figure out how to do something that is beyond a little Hello World project because the docs are not there. Now, the Java docs are fairly extensive, but how much digging through Java docs do you want to do in order to do something simple? In other words, I'd still give it a little time. Also, I put together this Ratpack app. I've been doing little Ratpack apps periodically for off and on for a couple of years now, and I did one a few months ago for this purpose, and it was on Ratpack 0.9.6. And then for this conference, I thought, let me just update that, the current version 0.9.8, and broke the entire app because all the APIs had changed, and I had to go fix it. The good news is 0.9.8 is working. You know, it's doing a good job. So at any rate, nice asynchronous I/O. That's the use of Netty in there. They have futures and promises, all this stuff. Optimized for Java 8 and Groovy, and does dependency injection using Google Juice. So that's all built right into the framework. Now, there's a project called Lazybones, provided by Peter Ledbrook. This is in a GitHub repo. And what it does is it generates project templates for you. It's sort of the analogous idea for a Maven archetype, more or less. I mean, it's not quite like that, but that's the basic idea, is that it generates a template. And if you're using GVM, then, for example, if I show you here, if I just say, let's see, I need an open window. If I say GVM current, you could see that one of them that's in there is this Lazybones project. I installed it directly, so I need to make that bigger, it looks like. And move that up. So let me say that again. Current. There's my Lazybones project. And if you read the docs on the GitHub repository, it says in order to use this, all you do is say Lazybones create, and then whatever the scheme they have is, and then whatever the name of the application you want is. So if I did here, if I did Lazybones list, it tells me all the ones that it's prepared to generate for you. Gradle, quick starts, and plugins, and Gaelic, and drop wizard, and various other little types here. And then, of course, one is Ratpack. Okay? So all I did was do Lazybones create Ratpack vampires, and that's the old one I had, and since I upgraded it and broke it, I made a new one yesterday. I mean, it took me an hour to do the porting and everything. The new one I figured, well, again, I'm going somewhat for the jokes here. Let me go back to this, and the new one is now called Vampire Weekend. Just seemed like the idea here. I suppose I should have called it Crypt or something like that. If you're going to serve up vampires, maybe Crypt would have made more sense. Or just call it a Buffy server. That would have worked too. But then the vampires would, never mind. I'm really going down a rat hole, aren't I? At any rate, This is what a Ratpack app looks like. It's got a source main Groovy folder, and it has a source Ratpack folder. And in the Ratpack folder is a script called ratpack.groovy. And this is the one that's being executed by the Netty server. This script is how you serve up data. Now, Ratpack is, the name, of course, comes from the Ruby framework known as Sinatra, which is a very similar idea. Very easy way to make microservices. And you have methods like get and post and put and delete. And simply by putting those methods in, you have enabled those various HTTP verbs, and you could respond accordingly. So, of course, if it's called Sinatra in the Ruby world, when they ported it to Groovy, it had to be called Ratpack, which is good enough reason to use it right there. I mean, what a great name for a framework. So at any rate here, what I want to do is I'll have a get request as a handler, and I also am going to have a get request with a string here. Now, what am I talking about here? I want to serve up my data. So I made a class here called a vampire server. And the vampire server is going to be the one that accesses the database through gmongo, grabs the movies, and I have two methods in it. Think of this as implementing the DAO, if you will. Find all by title and just find by title. Find by title is the simpler one. That says just do a find one with that title, whatever it may be, and then convert it to a movie and return that. Whereas find all by title says if there's a title, then do a find where the title matches this. It's like a like clause inside there. But if there's no title, just return everything. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to be a way I could do both in one query that I could figure out that worked in the database API. So I just went with this. And then when I get back the cursor, if it's not null, then take each one and transform it into a movie and return the collection of movies. Now, the other thing I did is because I'm accessing the database through here, and I only really want to do that once, I also applied the singleton AST transformation to this so that there's only ever one instance of this class. It implements the singleton design pattern exactly as you would expect. Makes the constructor private, puts in an instance attribute that's public, static inside there, and gives you a getter method to retrieve it, all ready to go. It's public, static, and final, in fact, all in there. So there's my vampire server. And before I go into serving things up, here is my vampire server spec. One of the nice things about Ratpack is it includes Spock as part of the dependency. So it already has the build file is expecting a Spock dependency, has a Spock dependency in it. And therefore, they're expecting you to test things with Spock. So here I made a vampire server spec, extend specification. There's my server. Of course, it's a singleton. Because it's a singleton, I added the @shared annotation on it because that means don't re-execute this in between each test. That's all it means. JUnit and Spock both reinitialize their attributes between each test. If you don't want that to happen, that's what the @shared is for. So here, when I say let's find by title for interview with a vampire, I do my server.find by title, I get back a movie, and then as in all Spock tests, then all of these statements are checked for the Groovy truth. So this says that the movie's not null. This says that its year is 1994, and the MPA rating is R, and I could check all the details. And here I say, find all movies where the title includes vampires. There's find all by title. I check that every movie satisfies that condition. When I go to the title, it's got the word vampire in it. Be very careful, by the way, there's a trap in Spock here. In general, we don't put in an assert keyword, right? There's no need for it because each statement is checked for the Groovy truth. If I said each here instead of every, this test passes whether they have vampire in them or not. Why? Because an each, as a method, returns the collection, and the collection's not null. Therefore, it passes by the Groovy truth. See, I'd have to put asserts inside the each block, inside the closure, in order to avoid that trap. Well, I'm avoiding the trap a different way. I'm using the every method, which returns a Boolean true only if every element of the collection satisfies the closure. So that's what I'm doing there. That's why I'm using every instead of each. Finally, I just checked that I've got the right number of movies in there, and this does, in fact, run correctly if I execute it, and then I'll go on to the next part. Yeah, so all the tests passed, which was nice. Now, I don't really like hardwiring in a number of movies and everything, but this was just a simple example to make sure everything was working properly. Technically, what I should do is go do a query and check or whatever, but nevertheless. So there was my vampire server. So then the question is, how am I going to serve this up? And that's where, I already have it open, the Ratpack class comes in. So in my script here, the imports which are being hidden, there's the import static of this Groovy Ratpack. This is the DSL, if you will, the thing that is read by the Ratpack server to be executed based on the HTTP requests. And then there's my singleton server instance. So in the handlers section, I'm saying if you get a GET request with no arguments, no path arguments, then on the response, set the header's content type to JSON, and then send the following response. I did my find all by title. In the request, in the query parameters, I pull the title out and take this whole thing. Now, this query right here, up to here, is going to return a collection of movie instances. And in principle, I could write another class that would serve up movie instances themselves. But to keep things simple right now, I'm just going to serve up strings, just to prove this works at all. So I converted the whole thing to strings. So that's going to return a collection, which may be empty or may be full, but either way, I get back a collection of strings. And then I also added in an additional part of the URL. This would be an extra part of the URL called movie. So set the content type again, and this time I'll do a find by title. Now, if you're going to put a title in the URL, that's kind of awkward. So I'm going to manually URL encode it. I'm going to put pluses in for the spaces, and therefore, when I get the title off the query param, I'll do a URL decode, and then do my find by title, and again serve up a string on all of that. So that's the basic idea. Now, the way you run this, and I'm going to run it from the command line, I can actually do it inside here because IntelliJ has this little terminal here, and it'll open it up on the root of the project. If I say Gradle W run, which is the way you run a Ratpack app, that will start it up, and it will run by default on port 5050, which is fine with me. I have nothing else going on that port. So it says Ratpack started for localhost 5050. If I now go to my browser and I open up a little tab here and go to localhost 5050 by itself, now that one I get all the movies with this parsing and everything. It's not happy about it. Let me put in a question mark title equals vampire, and there are all the vampire movies being rendered as a string in there. It's just a giant, again, I could refine this to actually render movies themselves, but it's working this way. And in fact, if I put in, let me take that off, if I put in /movie with a title, and you see I put in interview plus, actually you can't see it, let me magnify that. There's my movie title interview plus with plus the plus vampire. You like my little magnifier, by the way? It cost me $1. $1 in the Apple Store, 99 cents plus 1 cent tax. And I went, wait, that doesn't make sense anywhere. All right, I bought it anyway. What the heck? I like it. So, at any rate, see, there's a single movie coming out. There's that one, which I knew had Tom Cruise in it. I didn't realize it had Brad Pitt and Antonio Banderas. I might actually have to watch that movie at some point. I don't know. But at any rate, you see that I am serving up the toString method on movie for that individual movie. And that's my Ratpack service. I didn't go to the trouble to put in the post, put, or delete. I just wanted to demonstrate this much right at the moment. Okay? So now let me stop the server by, the brute force. Here's a Control-C just to kill it. And now I'm ready to leave this and go to Grails instead. So before I do that, here is the summary for Lazybones. Or from Ratpack rather. I'm implementing a class to return the vampire movies. That's the vampire server. It wraps the gmongo instance, and think of it like a movie DAO essentially. I just have find by ID, or really find by name and title rather, and find all by title. And there's my ratpack.groovy handler, returns the movie instances, and the Spock testing is in there. Oh, I forgot to show you that. Here, my little Ratpack server here, another thing you can do inside of Ratpack is here is a server integration spec. This is a class not the server integration specs, the class itself, but there are classes in Ratpack that allow you to do functional testing without starting up the server. Then you say the local script application under test, that's going to instantiate my Ratpack script. And then here's the built-in test client that they have, and they say put delegate on it. And now I can do, when I call get, look at the body of go to the body, go to its text, and I can print the result and then do a find all and make sure that there's 322 of them. And I can also do the get with a movie. So I did the interview with a vampire and printed that and checked the properties on it. And once again, this works, and I did not have to start Ratpack or anything. This will start Ratpack for me on some high number port and then run the tests and then shut it down as well. So that this this time it picks a random port in the tens of thousands each time. And then it starts it up and it prints out the details here. If I look at the second one, same thing, and then there's the movie being printed out. So I was able to test my server, my Ratpack script at all, using this mechanism. Very helpful that way. Very convenient. Okay. I figured I was going to go back into Barnes & Noble and see if the book had been bought, after sitting in the teen paranormal romance section. And I thought, you know what, maybe people need a clue. So I made up a Post-it note that said Groovy Vampires, page 220, and I was going to go and I was going to paste it on the cover of the book, figuring maybe they just didn't realize. And I went in and it was gone. And I was like, oh my God, did somebody actually buy this thing? So I went over to the info desk, and they know me, because, hey, did somebody buy my book? I'd ask periodically. And they looked it up and they went, no, there's still 2 copies in the store somewhere. And I'm like, oh no. So somebody moved it, now and that's the difference between moving something that's an ebook. You've only got the ebook, but if you move a physical book, I don't know where it is anymore. So waste by my own petard, but so be it. I did not go and take the other one and move it over again, so I left it there. And that one didn't sell either, I don't think, but so be it. All right, so now what about Grails? Let me do this with Grails, because the beauty of Grails is that it includes GORM, and Grails has a plugin that allows you to use a Mongo database as your data source. And with that plugin, you actually get limited GORM capabilities. You have dynamic finder methods, you have where queries, you have all those nice querying mechanisms, as long as, again, you provide the domain classes and everything that work with it. So it's got all these REST capabilities and the Mongo plugin. So the way you do the REST capabilities, and this is something I was talking about yesterday, is you add the @resource annotation to the domain class. You don't even need to provide a controller. All you have to do is put in the @resource here, and you do need to go in the URL mappings file and say what the URL is for this, so that you know how to access these guys. So in my movie class, I'm going to add @resource, and then in the URL mappings, I say movies, plural, goes to the movie class. It goes to that resource. And that will automatically map the various get, post, put, delete methods to the appropriate things in the RESTful controller. So in this case, I also want to specify that the default format will be JSON, because the way it defaults to it, it starts with XML if you don't specify. So this is one way to switch it to JSON, or to put JSON first will make that have a higher priority. And now I want to show you this really cool URL mappings report as well. So let me go back to IntelliJ here, and I will close my Ratpack project. No, I'll just open the other Ratpack IntelliJ project. This one is called Grails Vampires, as you might imagine. There's got to be a gag in there somewhere. I haven't found it yet, but something with a chalice, and he chose poorly, and I don't know exactly, but something, got to be one in there. I haven't quite found it. At any rate, here's my movie class. And this is a regular domain class, regular normal thing from Grails. And I have here my @resource on it. And then this is the concession to Mongo, is that I have an object ID as the ID now. And then there's all my data types. And these are basically the ones that are the extra classes, like ratings and dates and movie links and everything. Those are essentially the same classes that I used in the Ratpack app, with minor modifications. And then down here are the parts that are Mongo specific. First of all, you have to say map with Mongo in order to use the plugin. And now this part right here is basically saying that I have this big tree structure, right, with movies and then all these descendant projects. I don't want all those individual ones to have their own object ID, because they don't. So you use the embedded keyword just like you would in relational databases to say two tables are off of the same table. Two domain classes are mapped to the same table in relational tables. That would be embedded. That way they share a primary key. So here what I'm saying is all of these classes are sharing the primary key off of the movie class. But I did put in a has many on cast member down here. Now in the mapping block, I say what the database is and what the collection is, and I don't have a version column or anything like that. So there's my mapping for Mongo. Now if I also look at some of the other classes, just briefly here is cast member. You could see again, I have a map with Mongo, and that has many characters, which are just strings, and they're embedded. And I've got just a whole series of these things, and you can see all the map with showing up over and over again to see how the various pieces work. And whenever I had trouble getting something to work, I just changed the data type to string and figure I'll parse it after the fact. Okay? Now, inside the build config.groovy, there is the MongoDB plugin added as a compile time dependency. That's what the plugin recommends. That's how you install the MongoDB plugin inside. And then in the data source over here, the data source still has this, but it's being ignored. Here in my Grails section, I have a Mongo section to say what the host and the port is and the name of the database. I don't know that I need those individual mappings in the other one that I had. Once I did this, I think those become defaults. But nevertheless, I already had it, so I didn't take them out. But this is enough to start using the Mongo database. Now, everything worked remarkably easily until I ran into problems with like that enum where I wanted to change a dash to an underscore. And it's the sort of thing I've done with regular Grails apps and regular databases, relational databases many times, but it didn't work with Mongo. And I had Jeff Brown help me out for a while, sitting down trying to figure out why. And what we determined was that the problem was either in the driver or in the plugin, but it wasn't in anything we were doing in Grails. So eventually I just made that a string, as I say. I just kept it simple. So with all of that in there, and you'll notice, by the way, there are no controllers in this application. That's an empty directory. I'm simply using the built-in RESTful controller that comes from the @resource annotation. This will work. And if I go ahead and start the app running, I'll be able to access it. Now what I want to show you is a script that I've already prepared. Because what I want to do is I want to do a Grails console. I want to access it using the Grails console rather than the Groovy console. The Grails console is the Groovy console plus the various domain classes and the class path and all the GORM methods and everything defined for it, almost everything. Now I could go to this, but there's no point because remember I have no controllers. So that there's nothing to serve up on the website. I could add controllers, and normally what I would do is I would add scaffolded controllers, but I'm not sure how well the scaffolding works with Mongo, So I didn't want to fight that battle. I'm just serving this up as REST. So now what I want to do is execute the console command from the Grails target here. So that will start up a Grails console that has everything in it. And what I did in order to save us some time is I prepared a script right off the bat that I can use here. So as soon as the console comes up, I will be able to paste that script in here. You could see what I'm doing actually while we're waiting for that thing to come up. I have a with criteria method here, the normal Grails GORM with criteria. And here, I'll paste it in now. And I'll just show it to you before I clear this out. Let's do a clear output here. Okay, so there's my import of the domain classes. And then I said, with criteria, look for ratings which have a critic score greater than or equal to 50. And I also said, order them by ratings.critic score in descending order and a max of 10. And that'll return a collection, and for each one, print out because I didn't want to print out the whole thing because these objects are very big. So in order to restrict it, I said for each one, let's just print out the critic score and the title. And when I execute this, you see it works just fine. Ganja and the Black Vampire, Jesus, oh, what the heck? Oh my goodness, there's some really strange movies in there. I mean, these are the ones with critic scores higher than 50, you know? And what I really should have in here, you see there they are ordered by the critic score, Les Vampire or whatever. I mean, that's got 100 on it, man. I got to take a look at that one. This is the old classic from the 30s, and then there's various other ones, and you can see how they're ordered all the way down. But what I just have achieved is I've achieved Gorm methods on data being served up from a Mongo database after doing this mapping in a Grails app that serves up REST with a relatively small amount of code. You know, very easily done, very nicely done. So that's what I wanted to show you. Now I can also add in other things. I could change scores. I could print out other details. But that's the basic concept. So, I wanted to show you the URL mappings report. Absolutely. So this is in Documents IntelliJ Grails Vampires. So do I have that available? Let me open up a new tab, and I'll go to IntelliJ Grails Vampires. And if I do the interactive console, if I just say Grails here, and I execute, the reason I'm doing the interactive console, I don't need the interactive console. I could have just typed the command I want to type, but I get tab completion with the interactive console, so I don't have to remember the details. So if I go URL tab, there's a command called URL mappings report. And if I execute this, you will see what the @resource annotation generated based on the mapping file. So up here, this is our normal controller action ID mapping that we've always had. / goes to index, 500 errors go to error. This is the asset pipeline plugin. This is the database migration plugin. Again, these are just built into Grails right off the bat. And here is my movie controller, even though I don't have a controller like that. But movies with a GET request invokes the index action. And movies with a POST request would invoke the save action, etc., all the way down. Now, what I can do finally is if I go back and I say, what are the IDs here? And I didn't print out an ID, so let me actually print out m dot, I think it's just called ID as well. I'll tell you what, I'll put it in parentheses, $parentheses m dot ID, because I want to print an individual one as well. And you see that my IDs are these big monster things right here. So let me copy that, and now if I went to, for example, the console here, and let me quit this, and I'll say, whoops, quit. Figures. I'll figure it out later. Here we go. Curl -I -h, and I want my accept header is application/JSON, just in case. I probably don't even need that. And then I say localhost 8080. I am running under Tomcat, and then this is my application is called Grails Vampires. So there's Grails Vampires, and if I put in movies, then I would get a whole bunch of them. But if I put movies/ID, right, what we normally do, then I would get a single one, and that's why I went and printed out the ID so that I could paste it here, and I should get back the JSON data for that particular movie. So all of that is working. It's all inside there. It's just that the IDs are not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, based on this. Okay, so to finish up, this is what the URL mappings report prints up. And then I figured, okay, well, since apparently it wasn't true that people, teenage girls that are fond of, well, or boys too, for all I know, who are fond of vampire books apparently aren't into coding in Groovy. So I tried this one instead, still a better love story than Twilight. I don't know if I can use that or not. And unfortunately, there's the MongoDB plugin here listed in the slides, and I needed to add the object ID there to represent the one from Mongo, and put my static map width in there, and the embedded I mentioned, and then here was the block of datasource.groovy. This is all documented in the plugin documentation. And now I can use the Gorm methods like my with criteria or dynamic finders. They all work as well, or with queries. And as I say, maybe vampire fans don't buy Groovy, so that one doesn't really work. Groovy soup for a chicken soul. That one didn't work. So I tried making Java Hodor. You win or you throw a Groovyless code exception. And I thought, that's not right. It should be Hodor, right? Yeah, but so be it. At least I tried. So at any rate, in conclusion, what is in these slides, which I'll be sending in shortly, I did use the REST API from Rotten Tomatoes with a GET service and use MongoDB to store the JSON data locally. The Groovy JDK made the GET request very easy to use. I worked with the hypermedia, with the links for pagination. gmongo uses that delegate in a very effective way to provide a Groovy driver that wraps the Java driver. Ratpack works pretty easily. That is in my GitHub repo. That's the last thing I'll show you is where all that is. And then Grails 2.3 adds extra REST annotations and the URL mappings and the plugin, all that kind of stuff. And finally, I have this. There's my vampire bat, Groovy. I has it, I know. So at any rate, here is the place where you can get the code. So first of all, if I go to my own GitHub repository, and as I say, I can never get rid of that picture because I'll never have that much hair again. Anyway. This is the repo for the book, and in the book, in chapter 8, I believe, is my vampire movies section, and this has all that stuff for just accessing with a script, Rotten Tomatoes, and populating the Mongo database. That's all of that. I also have now the new one that I just put up, just to make it updated just right this morning, was the Vampire Weekend one. This is the Ratpack app that serves up all that information. I have not yet committed the Grails one. I want to play around with that a little bit more, but that'll be up there as well. So they're all off of my last name, and you can find everything inside there. So I know it was a silly idea, but it did give me a chance to play with all of these different technologies and something approximating a real-world scenario. So it was a lot of fun, and hey, I got a talk out of it too, so I guess it's deductible, But at any rate, so I had fun, and thank you very much for coming.